Hello there, and welcome back to this Sleeping History episode on the extraordinary, decadent, and often disturbing lives of the emperors of ancient Rome. If you're settling in for a calming and thought-provoking historical journey to carry you off to dreamland, you've chosen well. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and whether it's morning, afternoon, or the quiet of night. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if this kind of relaxing educational content suits you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Alright, let's embark on an even deeper dive into the world of Roman emperors, 4 times as detailed and expansive as our previous journey. Imagine again the marble-lined streets of the Eternal City, the glint of bronze helmets under the Mediterranean sun, and the murmur of Latin prayers drifting over the Forum. We will explore Rome's trajectory from a small city-state clinging to the Tiber River to the seat of a vast empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. We will walk with Caesar through the Rubicon, stand next to Augustus as he reimagines the city, sit in the amphitheater during a gladiator's last breath, share secrets whispered in imperial bedchambers, feel the heat of Vesuvius burying cities, witness the splendor of the Pantheon under Hadrian, shiver in the dark catacombs where persecuted Christians prayed, and gaze in wonder as Constantine sees the sign of the cross before battle. By the end of this expanded odyssey, you'll have met nearly every emperor, good and bad, and glimpsed how their personalities and decisions shaped the empire's destiny. We'll also examine the lives of ordinary Romans, patricians in their city houses, plebeians in cramped tenements, women weaving in atriums and whispering in bathhouses, slaves toiling in fields and kitchens, soldiers marching along dusty roads, children playing knucklebones, and soldiers building fortifications on distant frontiers. The story of Rome is both imperial and intimate, a grand narrative about power, law, and conquest, and a human tale of love, fear, hope, and endurance. So, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let history's currents carry you into the heart of the empire that never slept. The rise of the Roman Senate. At the break of dawn, in ancient Rome, the first rays of sun filter through the Forum, illuminating the grand facade of the Curia Julia. Inside this austere Senate house, marble floors echo with the soft shuffle of sandaled feet as Roman senators arrive one by one. They drape their togas, each adorned with a broad purple stripe reserved for their rank, and take their seats in long rows of benches. A sacred ritual has already taken place before sunrise. Augurs have taken the auspices, sacrificing a bird to ensure the day's proceedings have the gods' approval. Only then can the Senate convene. This morning, as on any proper day, the meeting begins at dawn and must conclude by dusk, for no session may outlast the daylight. In the soft glow of morning, motes of dust dance in the air of the Senate hall, and a calm quiet falls, the kind of expectant hush that has heralded deliberations for centuries in this assembly of elders. It was in this very manner that the Roman Senate had gathered since the city's mythical infancy. Romans themselves recounted that the Senate was born with the city. Legend holds that Rome's first king, Romulus, selected a council of about 100 elders, patres, or fathers, to advise him, thus founding the Senate from senex, old man. Over time, as Rome's population grew and its political structures evolved, the Senate expanded its numbers. Another early king, Tarquinius Priscus, is said to have added 100 more senators. By the late 6th century BCE, when the last king was expelled and the Roman Republic was established, the Senate became the advisory council to the new Republican magistrates. The Republican Senate typically comprised around 300 men, later more, mainly former magistrates and prominent citizens. These senators served for life, providing continuity and experience in governance. In those days, the Senate wielded immense prestige. It controlled state finances, managed foreign relations, and could decree the appointment of dictators in emergencies. All unofficial powers grounded in tradition and the collective weight of Rome's aristocracy. It became, as historian Polybius observed, the most powerful organ of the Republic in practice, even though technically it did not enact laws. The Senate's advice, its senatus consultum, was officially just that, advice, but in most cases, it was obeyed as though it were law. The paradox of the Senate was already evident. It had no formal legislative power, de jure, yet de facto its influence was decisive in guiding Rome's policies. Now, in our imagined dawn session, the day's presiding magistrate, perhaps one of the consuls, the highest elected officials of the Republic, calls the meeting to order. He stands at a podium, in reality, just a simple raised platform, and delivers the relatio, an opening speech outlining the matter at hand. The issue might be anything: a proposal to build a new aqueduct, an alarm about a barbarian incursion on the frontier, or perhaps an accusation of treason. As he speaks, the senators listen in respectful silence. These men, mostly in late middle age or older, are the elder statesmen of Rome. When the presiding consul finishes framing the topic, debate begins in the traditional manner. Senators speak in descending order of precedence, beginning with the princeps senatus, the ceremonial first man of the Senate, usually a venerable ex-consul chosen for his prestige. After him, each former consul, the consulares, shares his opinion, then each ex-praetor, and so on down the ranks. One by one, in measured tones, they rise to give their sententia, their verdict on the issue. The hall is filled with the low murmur of Latin oratory. Each speech might range from a curt agreement to a lengthy exhortation. A powerful orator can sway the mood of the room entirely. In a famous episode of 63 BCE, it was here that Cicero, then a consul, delivered impassioned speeches exposing the conspiracy of Catiline, thundering against the traitors in their midst. The painting above dramatizes that moment. Cicero's outstretched arm, Catiline skulking under scornful gazes. Such fiery invective was not everyday fare in the Senate, but it illustrates the high stakes that sometimes unfolded within these walls. More often, the tone was sober and procedural. As senior senators voice their views, younger members mostly listen. Many junior senators are content simply to indicate support for an elder's stance rather than speak at length themselves. In fact, a common scene in sessions was the pedarii, literally footmen, moving across the floor to sit or stand beside whichever speaker's opinion they agreed with. By physically clustering around a respected statesman during debate, these silent supporters signaled the growing consensus in the room. The rustle of togas and soft sandaled footfalls marked the shifting allegiances as debate progressed, but voices rarely rose in anger. Roman decorum demanded a certain gravitas from the Senate. There were witticisms and barbs, to be sure. Cicero was a master of those, yet always couched in formal rhetoric and respect for the Republic's dignity. Finally, after hours of discussion, when all who wish to speak have done so, the presiding magistrate calls for a vote. On major issues, the vote isn't a show of hands or roll call, but a physical division. Those in favor move to one side of the chamber, those against to the other. One can imagine the shuffling as the mass of senators divides, the outcome visible by the head count of white-robed figures on each side. If a majority favors the proposal, it passes as a senatus consultum, an official decree of the Senate. Though not a law in itself, under the Republic, only the citizen assemblies could enact laws. Such decrees carry immense moral authority. In most cases, the magistrates and people follow the Senate's guidance. On rare occasions, a tribune of the plebs might veto the decree, or the popular assembly might enact a law contrary to the Senate's stance. But those are exceptions. In the normal rhythm of the Republic, the Senate's pronouncements are tantamount to policy. Thus, day by day, year by year, in countless sessions, the Senate steered the Roman state. It oversaw finances, authorizing funds for armies and public works. It managed diplomacy, receiving ambassadors in its hall, deciding on war or peace, assigning provinces to generals. It administered Italy and the growing provinces, often mediating disputes or sending out senators as governors. All of this power, however, rested on consensus and tradition. The Senate had no army of its own, no formal executive authority. Its power flowed from the collective prestige, auctoritas, of Rome's aristocracy and the public's habit of deference. With the end of the Republic in the 1st century BCE, when ambitious generals like Julius Caesar and then his heir, Octavian, Augustus, took sole power, one might expect the Senate's role to fade. Indeed, under the Roman Empire, beginning 27 BCE, the Senate's influence did wane in practice. Emperors held the real power. They commanded the legions and controlled state finances. Yet even the all-powerful Augustus carefully preserved the veneer of republican tradition. He respected the Senate outwardly, consulting it and having it ratify his decisions, so that Rome would feel still governed by its old council of elders. Many emperors after him did the same. They wore the title princeps, meaning first citizen, rather than king, and sat in the Senate as its presiding member. The Senate, for its part, adapted to the new reality. It became a dignified advisory body and a training ground for high officials. Senators continued to debate, to pass decrees, often at the emperor's behest, and to administer certain internal matters. But they knew not to challenge an emperor openly. On occasion, when a tyrannical emperor was assassinated or died without an obvious heir, the Senate even played a role in the messy business of succession, declaring allegiance to a new claimant, or in rare cases choosing one. By and large, however, the Senate under the Empire lived on as a prestigious but secondary institution. Still, the outward forms persisted: the rituals at dawn, the debates, the votes and decrees. The Grand Council, founded in Rome's legendary past, endured century after century. In fact, a Roman Senate would survive even beyond the fall of the Western Empire. Emperors in Constantinople created a Senate for their new Eastern capital, and remarkably, an institution calling itself the Roman Senate met in the East until the 14th century CE. But all that lies far in the future. For now, in our early morning scene, we witness the Senate at the height of its classical role, the assembly of elders, guiding the fate of the Republic, and later the Empire, with steady, deliberate counsel. As the session concludes, the senators file out into the brightening forum, perhaps stopping to exchange a few quiet words with colleagues. Another day's advice to the magistrates has been given. Outside, the city of Rome is coming to life, and beyond the city, far-flung legions stand ready on the frontiers. It is to those legions, the mighty Roman army, that we now turn, as the steady heartbeat of Roman power moves from the halls of the Senate to the camps of the soldiers. Legions and the life of a Roman soldier. On a different day, in a different setting, a military camp on the northern frontier, near the misty banks of the Rhine. The air is crisp and carries the smell of wood smoke from last night's fires. Within the defensive ditch and rampart of the Roman castrum, rows of leather tents and wooden barracks are laid out in a perfect grid. As the first light spreads, a trumpet, buccina, sounds clear and high to signal the wake-up call. In their tents, Roman legionaries stir from sleep, muscles stiff on straw bedding. Soon campfires are kindled anew, and the men begin their morning tasks, packing up bedrolls, polishing armor and weapons, and preparing a simple breakfast of grain porridge or coarse bread. A typical legionary's ration is heavy on wheat. Bread or porridge is the staple of every meal, supplemented by a bit of salted meat or cheese when available. The daily grain allotment for a soldier is generous. Later sources suggest it could be on the order of several kilos, a volume of perhaps 8 liters of wheat, issued to be ground and baked. Bread is truly the fuel of the Roman military machine. As the sun climbs, the camp springs to disciplined activity. A Roman legion at full strength consists of roughly 5,000, 6,000 men, about 10 cohorts of 480 men each, plus officers and cavalry detachments. The basic unit is the century, about 80 legionaries commanded by a centurion, and within it, squads of 8 men share tents and mess pots. These tentmates, concubinales, live as a tight-knit team, marching, camping, and fighting side by side. In the morning chill, squads gather around each tent, adjusting belts and securing the segmented plates of their armor, the shining lorica segmentata. The bronze helmets are donned, each with cheek plates snug against the face. One can hear the jingle of chainmail and the clatter of metal as equipment is strapped on. Every legionary carries the tools of a professional. Heavy infantryman, a short sword, gladius, on the right hip, a dagger on the left, and 2 heavy javelins, pila, to be thrown as the battle commences. Additionally, and not least, he shoulders a stout shield, scutum, nearly a meter tall, curved to cover the body's profile. The legionary's load is substantial. In fact, part of the genius of Rome's military success was the self-sufficiency of its soldiers on the march. Each man carries not only arms and armor, but also his own pack of supplies, a bundle that might weigh some 80 Roman pounds, over 35 kilograms. Poles, cooking pots, a cloak, rations, and entrenching tools are lashed together and slung over the shoulder. Roman generals long ago learned that if soldiers carry their own gear, the army can move faster without a baggage train, hence the nickname Marius's mules, after the general Marius who reformed the legions. The training has made them fit for this burden. After months of drill, a legionary is expected to march at least 20 Roman miles, 30 kilometers, in 5 hours with full pack, and in forced marches even more. In fact, with rigorous practice and daily toil, Roman troops famously achieved marches of up to 37 kilometers in a day, carrying about 36 kilograms of gear. Endurance like this astonishes their foes. The secret, beyond natural stamina, is relentless training. A typical day in camp, when not engaged in battle or long marches, is filled with exercises. After breakfast, under the centurion's watchful eyes, the legionaries might drill in weapons practice. Roman recruits are famously trained with equipment heavier than the real thing. Vegetius, a Roman military writer, notes that young soldiers were given wicker shields, twice the weight of normal and wooden swords, double the weight of standard steel blades. Clad in this extra weight, they thrust and strike at wooden posts driven into the ground, rehearsing killing blows again and again. In our camp, one can imagine lines of bare-chested men under the sun, grunting in unison as they lunge at practice targets, sweat glistening on muscled arms, the heavy thump of wood striking wood. They do this every morning and afternoon without fail. When later wielding their actual swords and lighter shields in combat, they will find them swift and manageable by comparison. A deliberate training outcome to enhance their agility in battle. Aside from sword drills, soldiers practice throwing their javelins, wrestling, running, and building fieldworks. A Roman legion is as much a construction crew as a fighting force. If the army is on the march, every evening they stop and dig a new defensive camp, ditch, rampart, wooden stakes. The routine is muscle memory to them. Such ceaseless labor hardens the men. They become engineers in uniform, laying roads, bridging rivers, raising palisades. Commanders cleverly utilize each soldier's pre-military trades as well. If a recruit was once a blacksmith, he might be assigned to the armorer's workshop. If he was a carpenter, to building siege engines or boats. In a marching camp, you would see groups of men baking bread in earth ovens, cobbling sandals, tending pack mules, or forging nails. A whole mobile city of professions carried with the legion. Those without trades will still learn to swing pickaxes and shovels, to dig fortifications and clear roads. No one is idle. Discipline is iron. The centurions, each identifiable by his vinewood cane and transverse crested helmet, circulate to ensure every task is done promptly and properly. They do not hesitate to crack a cane across a slacker's back to drive the lesson home. For the Roman soldier, discipline is a daily reality enforced by strict punishment. The rules are simple and unforgiving. If a sentry falls asleep on duty, the penalty is death, traditionally by clubbing or stoning by his comrades. Cowardice in battle or desertion en masse can invoke the dreaded punishment of decimation. Every 10th man in the guilty unit is chosen by lot and executed, usually beaten to death by the other 9, a brutal measure used rarely but remembered by all. As one account by the historian Polybius describes, the uncertain chance of drawing the short lot and the collective shame inflicted on the unit made decimation a terrifying deterrent. Lesser infractions, being late to formation, losing equipment, incur beatings, reduced rations, or extra fatigue duties. The legionaries' daily bread can literally be taken away as punishment. Disgraced soldiers might be issued barley instead of wheat, a mark of humiliation among Roman troops. Yet alongside fear, there are also positive rewards that bind the soldiers. A record of brave conduct might earn a man a corona, a military decoration, or a promotion to the elite first cohort. After the standard long service, originally 16 years in the late Republic, extended to 20, and then 25 years by the Empire, a legionary earns an honorable discharge, often with a pension or grant of farmland. Many veterans settle together in colonies, founding new Roman towns and spreading Latin culture to the provinces. They become respected men, citizens with full rights indeed. For auxiliary troops who are non-citizens, completion of service grants Roman citizenship as a reward. This promise of land, citizenship, and status upon retirement is a powerful motivator through the grueling years of service. Imagine now it is midday. The training drills pause, and the men take their noon meal, a bit of salted pork or fish if lucky, with bread and perhaps a cup of posca, the sour wine diluted with water that soldiers favor to quench thirst. They gather in small groups under any shade they can find, joking and chatting in a rough soldier's Latin that picks up words from all over the empire. A legion is a melting pot. Italians, Spaniards, Gauls, Thracians, all bonded by the army. In the Roman ranks, they become brothers. The veterans, their arms and faces, tanned and scarred, might share tales with the fresh recruits, stories of far-off campaigns, of the stern lessons taught by battle. The atmosphere in a Roman camp, despite strict order, isn't grim all the time. Soldiers have downtime to gamble with dice, write letters home, or sing marching songs around the fire. Camaraderie is essential. Men often address each other as "frater" in the heat of combat. Centurions, though disciplinarians, also lead by example with courage and protectiveness toward their units. On campaign, after the midday rest, the legions might break camp and march again. Picture the long column snaking across the landscape. Legionaries in serried ranks, marching in step, each man's armor gleaming, and the red tunic beneath fluttering in rhythm. Standards topped with eagles and gods glitter in the sun. For hour upon hour they tramp, dust clinging to sweating limbs, the sun beating on helmeted heads. But the men maintain their formation and their famously swift pace. Their training has made this routine. They sing cadent songs to keep morale up. If an enemy force ambushed them now, the column could instantly form a battle line, each century wheeling into place like a drilled machine. We follow them through a day's march to evening. As the sun sets, the legion halts, and at the blare of trumpets, fans out to set up another marching camp. Every soldier knows his duty. Some dig the trench and throw up the earth to form a rampart. Others chop wood for spikes and gate supports. Others start the fires and begin cooking the grain into mash. By nightfall, a fortified mini-city stands where open field had been a few hours before. Sentries take their posts at the gates and along the rampart, peering into the darkness. Inside, around glowing campfires, the soldiers huddle in cloaks against the chill, eating their simple supper. Perhaps tonight an officer reads aloud a newly arrived letter from Rome, news that a new emperor has been declared, or that their last victory has earned them a triumph in the capital. The men cheer, raising wooden cups of wine in salute. Someone starts a bawdy marching song, and others join in softly. Eventually, one by one, they retire to their tents or barracks. The sounds of the camp die down, giving way to the night noises of the frontier, a distant wolf's howl, the chirp of insects, the crackle of the perimeter watchfires. Under the vast canopy of stars, these tough Roman soldiers sleep lightly, their swords within arm's reach. They will wake before dawn to do it all again, to march, to build, to train, ever ready to fight. What is it like when battle finally comes? The legionaries form up in their tight ranks, shields overlapping, peeler javelins at the ready. At a signal, they launch the heavy javelins into the enemy mass, a deadly volley designed to disrupt and demoralize. Then, drawing their gladii, they advance with a shout, the front row crouching slightly behind their curved shields. The impact is a clash of iron and a wall of shields shoving forward. Roman soldiers are taught to thrust, not slash, with their short swords. A quick stab into the foe's belly or thigh behind the shelter of the shield. A mere 2 inches of penetration can fell an enemy, and the Romans know how to do this efficiently. In the melee, discipline holds. Each century stays as a unit, responding to the centurion's commands, often audible via whistle or shouted orders. If one man falls, the comrade behind steps forward to fill the gap. The training, the endurance from endless marches, and the absolute obedience to command all combine to give the Romans an edge, even against fiercer or more numerous foes. Many ancient observers remarked how the Roman legions, though not as individually tall as Gauls or as flamboyantly brave as others, would grind their enemies down by sheer organization and steadiness. A handful of men inured to war proceeds to certain victory against a multitude of untrained, wrote Vegetius, crediting Roman greatness to strict discipline and drill. By late afternoon, perhaps this battle is won. The enemy breaks and runs. The legionaries, bloodied but victorious, reform lines and chant triumphantly, raising their standards. After the fighting, they mourn their dead in brief, stoic rites, then set to the grim work of tending the wounded and gathering spoils. Discipline resumes immediately. No wild celebrating or looting without orders. The commanders issue rewards on the spot for acts of heroism, a civic crown to the man who saved a citizen's life in battle, armillae, bracelets, or phalae, medallions, for other brave soldiers, which the recipients will wear proudly on their dress armor during parades. In the evening, around campfires, they might recount the day's feats. Comrades congratulate the bravest among them, or rib those who perhaps faltered. But if anyone openly showed cowardice, he will be dealt with harshly. Perhaps he'll be flogged, or in extreme cases, the unit punished by the dreaded lot casting. By such stern methods, the legion remains a cohesive, effective force. What emerges from this daily life of a Roman soldier is a portrait of resilience and order. These men are not mere brutes. They are professionals, arguably the best trained fighting force of the ancient world. Their identity as Roman soldiers becomes all-consuming. They march under the proud symbol of the eagle, the aquila, and each legion has its own number and nickname, like Legio X, Fretensis, or Legio II, Augusta. A strong esprit de corps binds them. They won't let their unit's honor be stained by failure if they can help it. And beyond loyalty to unit and general, there is loyalty to Rome itself, to the abstract idea of the Republic or the Emperor that they serve. Many are volunteers, others were conscripted in earlier times, but by the time they've endured the training and fought shoulder to shoulder, they all share in the glory of the Roman military tradition. We should also note the non-citizen soldiers, the auxiliaries. These are cavalrymen from Numidia, slingers from the Balearic Isles, archers from Syria, wild Germanic horsemen, all fighting alongside the legions as allied troops. They lack the heavy armor and the citizenship status, but they are crucial to Rome's army. An auxiliary's term of service is longer, 25 years, but at the end, he earns citizenship as a reward for his duty, a path of upward mobility that ties diverse peoples to the Roman state. Our day with the Roman army draws to a close with a sense of awe at what these soldiers achieve. Through their roads and swords, they have secured a vast empire. It is the legions who stand guard on the frontiers, who have built bridges over the Rhine and Danube, who have conquered Gaul, Spain, Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. They carry not just weapons, but Roman civilization itself in their camps and colonies. In peaceful times, they might be building walls in Britannia, like Hadrian's Wall, or digging canals in the Nile Delta. In war, they are nearly unstoppable by the standards of their day. The life of a Roman soldier is hard, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and long. One might adapt Hobbes, yet it is fueled by pride and purpose. When we imagine a lone legionary standing sentry on a quiet night, gazing at the stars under some foreign sky, far from his Italian home, we sense something of the inner life of these men. Maybe he hums a tune from childhood, or fingers a small charm, perhaps a pendant of Jupiter or Mars that he carries for luck. Superstition and faith accompany the soldier too, as he prays to the gods for protection in battle. The army has its own rituals. The standards are sacred, and oaths sworn on them are binding. If a standard is lost in battle, it's a deep disgrace, and legions went to great lengths to recover them. All these elements, discipline, camaraderie, sacrifice, and ritual, forged the Roman military into a formidable instrument of the state. The soldier's contribution to Rome's story is immense. With sword and shield, they carved out an empire. With shovel and axe, they built its infrastructure. Their very presence on the frontiers for centuries helped Romanize distant lands. When their service is done, many retire as farmers or settlers, bringing with them Latin language and Roman ways of life, thus seeding the empire's culture far and wide. It is often said that the Pax Romana, the long period of relative peace and stability during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, was won and maintained by the legions. The world within Rome's borders enjoyed safety for trade and travel, largely because these soldiers stood ready at the edges. As we leave the clank of armor and the regimented rows of the legion, we transition to consider what those soldiers helped secure: the flourishing heart of the empire. The Roman peace enabled grand achievements in engineering, architecture, and urban life. The roads they built will carry us now back to the city, where aqueducts, baths, amphitheaters, and temples await our exploration. The army has done its work in expanding and protecting Rome's domain. Now we look at how the Romans, with the security provided by their soldiers, created the marvels of infrastructure and architecture that still awe us today. Engineering marvels, aqueducts, roads, and the Colosseum. It is often said that Rome's greatness was built in concrete and stone. The Romans were master builders, and the physical imprint of their empire was as much a source of pride as their military conquests. Traveling across Roman lands, one would see straight roads, arrowing across plains and over mountains, lofty aqueduct arches, striding over valleys, and magnificent public buildings adorning cities. These engineering feats were not just utilitarian, they were symbols of Rome's dominion over nature and its benevolence in spreading civilization. Let us take a slow journey through some of the signature achievements of Roman engineering and architecture, imagining their impact on daily life in the empire. We begin with water, the aqueducts. The city of Rome swelled to a population of perhaps 1 million at its height, a size unheard of in the ancient world. Supplying clean water to so many people was a challenge the Romans met with ingenious aqueduct systems. By the 1st century CE, 11 major aqueduct lines snaked their way into Rome from the surrounding hills. These aqueducts, some running mostly underground, others carried on stately arches, delivered a staggering volume of fresh water each day. Modern estimates suggest that over 1 million cubic meters of water flowed into Rome daily by the late empire, which works out to roughly 200 gallons, 750 liters per person, per day in the city. This abundance meant that not only did Romans have enough to drink and cook with, but also to supply public baths, ornamental fountains, and even artificial lakes for naval shows. Standing in Rome, you would hear water everywhere, gushing from spouts into public basins, spraying from decorative fountains in forums and gardens, or rushing beneath the streets in lead pipes toward private homes of the wealthy. This sound of water was, in a way, the sound of Roman urban life, a constant, pleasant backdrop made possible by engineering. How did these aqueducts work? The principle was simple: gravity, flow. Engineers identified springs or rivers in the highlands, sometimes many dozens of miles from the city, and channeled water gently downhill along a carefully surveyed gradient. The channels, often made of stone and lined with waterproof concrete, maintained a very slight slope, just enough to keep water moving over long distances without stagnating. Most of the length of an aqueduct ran underground through tunnels to protect the water and maintain the grade. Where valleys or lowlands intervened, the watercourse was carried above ground on archways. The Roman arch, perfected with their strong concrete, allowed them to span wide gaps and maintain a steady slope. If you travel outside Rome, even today, you can see some of these lofty arcades marching across the countryside. In some places, 2 or 3 tiers of arches stacked high. One of the most famous examples is the Pont du Gard in southern Gaul, modern France, a towering bridge of golden stone that once supported an aqueduct channel across the Gardon River. It stands almost 50 meters high, its elegant arches reflected in the flowing river below. The sight of it must have astonished local people in its day, and it still inspires awe now. Indeed, the Pont du Gard, shown above, is a testament to the Romans' ability to marry functionality with beauty. Each massive arch was constructed using precise masonry and wooden scaffolds. When an aqueduct approached a city like Rome, it often terminated in a grand water distribution tank called a castellum aquae, from which branches led to various districts. The Romans took pride in their water quality. They had an entire office of water commissioner, curator, aquarum, and a staff of aqueduct maintenance workers, as recorded by Sextus Julius Frontinus, a first-century official who wrote about Rome's water system. Maintenance was critical. Mineral deposits could clog channels. Earthquakes could cause leaks. The Romans built vertical shafts every to 20 yards along the underground stretches so that workers could access and clean the channels. They even had provisions against aqua furtiva, water theft. Illicit tapping of the water lines by private individuals was common enough that laws were passed, and water police, of a sort, patrolled for unauthorized pipes puncturing the channels. Patricians would sometimes bribe officials to divert extra water to their estates. Frontinus sternly writes of shutting down such illegal branches. For everyday Romans, the aqueducts were a blessing. Before aqueducts, the city relied on the muddy Tiber River and a few springs or wells. Water was scarce and often polluted. With the aqueducts, fresh water flowed continuously. In the city, you could visit any number of public fountains and find clear, cool water pouring from spouts shaped like lions' heads into stone basins. Children splashed and played around these fountains. Women filled clay jars to carry home, and old men refilled their cups. Emperors and wealthy citizens donated elaborate monumental fountains, like the Meta-Sudans, near the Colosseum, to beautify the city and underscore that Rome was the provider of water, almost godlike in its life-giving generosity. Water also allowed the proliferation of public baths, which we'll speak of shortly. It even made possible certain entertainments. For instance, some venues, before the Colosseum substructure was built, could be flooded for mock naval battles to amuse the populace, a drain on water that the aqueduct system could absorb in stride. While water flowed in stone arteries across the empire, on the ground radiated another network, the famous Roman roads. The Romans built an unprecedented road system of about 50,000 miles of paved highways, linking their vast domains. These roads connected cities, army camps, and provinces from Britain to Mesopotamia. The old saying, "All roads lead to Rome," was more than metaphorical. It described a literal reality in which 29 great roads fanned out from the capital, their distances measured by gilded milestones. As you travel along a Roman road, you notice its defining traits: remarkable straightness where terrain permitted, a cambered surface arched slightly for rainwater to run off, and a sturdy multi-layer foundation of stones and gravel that kept it dry and hard. A typical cross-section started with a dug trench filled with compacted sand or earth, then layers of coarse stones, smaller gravel, and finally large, flat paving stones on top, fitted tightly together. The result was a durable roadway that could endure the pounding of hooves and wagon wheels for centuries. Many Roman roads are still in use today, paved over by modern asphalt, but following the exact line first laid down 2 millennia ago. Consider the Appian Way, Via Appia, one of the earliest and most important roads, begun in 312 BCE. It led southeast from Rome to Capua and later extended to Brundisium on the Adriatic coast. Walking on the Appian Way in antiquity, you'd see a broad road, perhaps 15 feet wide, flanked by drainage ditches and sometimes sidewalks or riding tracks. At regular intervals stood the miliares, the mile markers, each carved stone telling you how far you were from the capital in Rome. Travelers, whether legions on the march, merchants' ox-drawn carts, or official couriers, could make excellent time. Thanks to the firm roadbed, wagons did not sink into mud in winter, and good drainage meant they were rarely washed out. An official courier service, the cursus publicus, maintained relay stations with fresh horses along major routes, allowing imperial messages to traverse the empire with astonishing speed for the era. A rider might cover 50 miles a day or more using these stations. For common travelers, there were roadside inns, mansiones, at intervals where one could find food and lodging, though ancient sources often warn of their lumpy beds, coarse wine, and fleas. Still, for the first time in history, one could travel from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Euphrates on roads built to a single standard, under a single authority. This network facilitated trade. Spices, grain, olive oil, and wine crisscrossed the empire, as well as cultural exchange. Along the roads marched not just soldiers and merchants, but also ideas, fashions, and religions. It is often noted that the spread of early Christianity owed something to the ease of travel on Roman roads. Standing by a Roman road, one might also notice other infrastructure: stone bridges with arches spanning streams, milestones with Latin inscriptions, and perhaps in more dangerous stretches, even road police or patrols provided by nearby garrisons to protect against bandits. The roads were a point of pride. Emperors took to inscribing their names on repaired sections, and the office of road curator was an esteemed public duty. If a section needed repaving, local cities or the imperial government would fund it, a sound investment in keeping the arteries of empire healthy. Over time, even as Western Rome fell to ruins, these roads endured, keeping the bones of a once great unity visible on the landscape. Medieval travelers often still followed Roman roads, the old stones guiding their way long after the empire's banners had faded. Now, refreshed by the waters and conveyed by the roads, we arrive at the heart of a Roman city to admire its architecture. Roman cities, whether Rome itself or provincial centers like Carthage, Ephesus, or Antioch, were adorned with splendid public buildings that both served practical needs and acted as stages for civic life. Among these, none encapsulates Roman urban culture better than the public baths, the amphitheaters, and the grand temples and basilicas. But for our narrative, we'll focus on the baths and the most famous amphitheater of all, the Colosseum, as key exemplars of Roman engineering brilliance. Imagine walking into Rome's baths of Caracalla on a lazy afternoon around AD 220. Approaching the complex, you pass through an entrance flanked by decorative gardens and statues. The scale is astonishing. The entire bath complex covers some 11 hectares, over 27 acres. The main building's brick and concrete walls loom 30 meters high, still richly decorated with mosaics and marble veneer. The baths of Caracalla were one of the largest ever built, second only to the later baths of Diocletian. They could accommodate some 1,600 bathers at a time, and up to 8,000 visitors in a single day. Essentially, a small city of leisure. The complex wasn't just for bathing. Upon entry, you might first wander in the Palaestra, an open-air exercise ground, where men are sparring with boxing gloves or tossing a ball back and forth in vigorous exercise. Others are wrestling or lifting weights. It's a scene of lively physical activity. After working up a sweat, it's time for the bathing ritual. You pass into the caldarium, the hot bath. This is a vast circular hall under a soaring dome, one that rivaled the Pantheon's dome in span. Through the misty air, lit by shafts of sunlight from high windows, you see bathers soaking in a steaming pool. The water is heated by an ingenious system. Beneath the marble floor, slaves tend furnaces that burn 10 tons of wood each day to keep the waters hot. Hot air circulates through hollow spaces under the floor, hypercaust, and up through the walls, effectively turning the entire room into a giant sauna. You ease into the hot pool. The heat envelops you, soothing muscles and opening pores. After a good soak, and perhaps a scrape down with a strigil, a curved metal tool Romans used to slough off oil and sweat, you move to the tepidarium, a warm room for intermediate cooling. Here, friends might recline on benches, chatting amiably amid more moderate warmth. Next, the frigidarium, the grand cold hall, one of the focal points of the complex. The frigidarium in Caracalla's baths is a magnificent chamber with a soaring ceiling. Its enormous pool of unheated water lies still and inviting. You take the plunge into the cold pool. The chill is bracing, making you gasp and then laugh. All around, the halls are richly decorated. Floors are covered in colorful mosaics depicting sea creatures and athletes. Columns of veined marble, imported from Egypt and Turkey, line the rooms, and niches hold statues of gods like Hercules and Apollo. Everywhere the sound of splashing water echoes and mingles with relaxed conversation. Bathing was a daily social ritual for Romans of all classes, at least those in the cities. Here the wealthy and the poor might bathe side by side, though at Caracalla's elite complex, you'd mostly see ordinary citizens. The truly poor frequented smaller neighborhood baths. It's a place to meet friends, conduct business discussions, or even hear poets recite. The baths often had lecture rooms and libraries attached. Yes, Libraries. Caracalla's baths, like many large thermae, included reading rooms and gardens within the complex. There were also food vendors, masseurs ready to anoint you with perfumed oils, and barbers to trim your hair and beard after the bath. In essence, a Roman bathhouse was wellness center, gym, and community hub in one. After lingering perhaps an hour or more, moving among the hot, warm, and cold rooms, the typical sequence caldarium, tepidarium, frigidarium, you dry off and dress. Stepping back outside, you feel refreshed and calm, as many Romans did in the afternoon after their bath. A cool breeze rustles the neat rows of plane trees in the gardens. Groups of bathgoers stroll and chat. The sun is now lower in the sky. Some of these people might head next to the theatre or the amphitheatre if games or shows are scheduled, or perhaps to the forum to hear a rhetorician's speech. The city offers many diversions, and chief among them, in terms of spectacle and sheer capacity, were the amphitheatres for blood, sport, and the circuses for chariot racing. Let us step into the most renowned of these venues, the Colosseum of Rome, to witness the pinnacle of Roman entertainment architecture. The year is AD 80. Rome's newest marvel, the Flavian Amphitheatre, better known to us as the Colosseum, has just been completed and is about to be inaugurated with a grand festival of games. As you approach it, the sight is breathtaking. An elliptical stadium of stone rising over 150 feet high, its exterior ringed by 3 tiers of arches and half columns in different styles, simple Doric at the bottom, then Ionic, then ornate Corinthian on top. The sun-bleached travertine stone gleams almost golden in the light. 50,000 Romans are streaming in, yet it never feels too crowded at the entrances. The architects have devised 80 numbered gates at ground level, each corresponding to a section of seating. You hand a ticket, a pottery shard with a section and row number, to an usher and move through a vaulted corridor. Slanting shafts of light from the exterior arches play on the walls as you ascend one of the many staircases. The Romans call these exit entry corridors vomitoria because they spew forth crowds efficiently. In minutes, you emerge into the bright arena bowl. The noise of the crowd swells, excited chatter, vendors crying out their wares, fruits, nuts, watered wine, children laughing. The smell of sprinkled saffron and herbs used to freshen the air and perhaps mask the scent of wild animals wafts by. You find your marble seat in the section appropriate to your social class. Roman seating is strictly stratified. The front row podium is for senators and VIPs, including the Emperor's box and the Vestal Virgin's box, directly facing each other for the best view. Just above are the equestrians, knights, then the fair. Broad Mainianum secundum for ordinary citizens. Richer folk in the lower half, poorer in the upper. At the very top, under the colonnade, is standing room or wooden benches for women, other than vestals, and the lowest status viewers, even slaves and freemen, can watch from up there. On this inauguration day, the Colosseum is packed to capacity. Later calculations suggest around 50,000 on average, but some ancient sources claim up to 80,000 could be crammed in. The design ensures everyone has a view of the oval arena below, which measures about 83 by 48 meters of flat sand. The Latin word for sand, arena, gives us arena. Above, on this hot summer day, attendants are unfurling the great velarium, an enormous canvas awning that stretches over much of the seating like a giant sail. Ropes and pulleys run up to dozens of masts around the amphitheatre's rim, operated by sailors from the Roman navy, specially assigned to this duty. As the awning spreads, it casts a cooling shade over the crowd and catches the breeze, funneling a soft draft downward, an ancient form of climate control for comfort. Everyone settles in anticipation. Trumpets blare and a procession enters. Ranks of gladiators in gleaming armor salute the emperor with the famous phrase, Ave, Imperator, morituri, te salutant. Hail, Emperor! Those who are about to die salute you. Over the next 100 days, yes, Emperor Titus has decreed games for 100 straight days. Romans will witness an astonishing program of entertainment, gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, executions of criminals, and even simulated battles. On this first day, exotic animals from across the empire are paraded: elephants from Africa, tigers from Asia, stags and ostriches and crocodiles, many destined to be hunted in staged hunts called venaciones. The arena sand is fresh and yellow, soon to be stained red. When the games commence, the Colosseum becomes a theatre of life and death. Gladiators, of various types, the heavily armoured Secutor with sword and shield, versus the nimble Retiarius armed with net and trident, engage in duels that demonstrate skill, courage, and brutality. The crowd roars at a well-placed blow, or a dramatic turn of fortune. Those in the stands wager on outcomes, applaud their favourites, and jeer the cowards. If a gladiator is wounded and yields, the match pauses, as everyone looks to the emperor or editor of the games for the verdict. Will the defeated be spared, missio, or slain? Tradition holds that a thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, the exact nature of which historians debate, indicates mercy or death. The ambiance is strange to modern eyes, a mix of festivity and gore. But to Romans, this is part of the social fabric, a grand display of Roman valor and the stoic embrace of fate. It is also a way to dispense justice. Condemned criminals might be executed in the arena as interludes, sometimes via staged mythological scenes, and to appease the populace with free entertainment. During midday intermissions, the arena might be cleared and set for novelty acts, perhaps acrobats or recreations of famous battles. There are accounts that at the Colosseum's inaugural games, the arena was even flooded to reenact a naval battle with real ships, though later, with the construction of the hypogeum, the underground complex of tunnels and animal cages beneath the floor, flooding became impractical. Nonetheless, for early spectacles, they may have ingeniously piped water in from an aqueduct to create a shallow artificial lake for small galleys to skirmish. If that happened, one can imagine the wonder of spectators as the sandy floor gave way to gleaming water and ships with armed men maneuvered as if on the sea. The engineering behind the Colosseum is as impressive as the shows. Beneath the arena floor lies the hypogeum, a 2-level subterranean warren of chambers and corridors. Dozens of elevators and trapdoors built into the floor. Stagehands below can suddenly release a lion into the arena, or pop up scenery and gladiators from nowhere. These mechanisms, winched by strong slaves, add a thrilling element of surprise to the spectacles. The spectators might see the sandy floor suddenly part as a platform rises, bearing a snarling tiger or a troupe of performers, eliciting gasps from the crowd. Hidden pipes could even spray perfumed water into the air for a refreshing mist. And when it was time to clear the arena of bodies or carcasses, attendants would swiftly rake fresh sand over the gore. Hence our phrase, turning thumbs down, may come along with turning down a gladiator's life, but also covering over the blood with sand. After hours of continuous shows, the spectacle ends for the day, and the orderly egress of the crowd begins. Thanks to the ample exits and well-designed corridors, the entire Colosseum can empty in mere minutes, a fact that awes modern stadium designers. As you step out into the late afternoon sun of the Roman streets, you are perhaps exhilarated and exhausted by the sheer sensory overload of the Colosseum. Many in the crowd will discuss the events all evening, how bravely one gladiator fought, or the clever trick a beastmaster used to corral a charging rhinoceros. These stories will be retold in bars and dinner parties. In fact, the phrase bread and circuses, panem et circenses, coined by the poet Juvenal, refers exactly to this combination, the free-grain dole and the spectacular games that keep the urban masses content. The Colosseum stands then, as it does now in partial ruin, as an icon of Roman engineering and entertainment. It embodies both the grandeur and the cruelty of Roman public life. Constructed in concrete, its design is so efficient that even today, looking at its remains, one can trace the vomitoria and stairways that handle crowds, the numbered gate markers, the sockets for the velarium masts. It's a testament to how Romans could build on a massive scale for utility and pleasure. Emperor Vespasian, who began it, famously funded its construction with spoils from the Jewish war, including the sack of Jerusalem's temple. In a real sense, it was a victory monument turned to the people's use. Our tour of Roman engineering could go on. We could visit the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill, or the Pantheon with its unmarred dome, or the sprawling forums with their basilicas and columns. Each would show us the Roman genius for adapting and innovating. They borrowed the arch from the Etruscans, and the dome perhaps from Hellenistic ideas, and then pushed both to new heights with their invention of strong concrete, opus caementicium, using volcanic ash that set even underwater. They faced concrete with brick and marble to make it beautiful. They built multi-story apartment blocks, insulae, to house the masses, and sewers like the Cloaca Maxima to drain the forum's swampy ground into the Tiber. The cities were furnished with colonnaded streets, triumphal arches, and functional amenities like public latrines, flushed by continuous water flow from aqueduct overflow. On the frontier, they built forts and walls of astonishing longevity. Parts of Hadrian's Wall in Britain still stand. In the harbours, they poured concrete piers that hardened underwater, creating artificial ports like Claudius's port at Ostia. Everywhere in the empire, one found the mark of Roman order and ambition in the built environment. A traveller in Gaul might drink from a fountain fed by an aqueduct built by Roman engineers, and then travel to the next town on a Roman road, guarded by milestones and patronized by imperial posthouses. Arriving in the town, he could relax in a local bathhouse. All sizable Roman towns had at least one. Watch a gladiator show in the local amphitheatre, more modest than the Colosseum, but operating on the same idea, and see a play in a Roman theatre. Thus, through infrastructure and architecture, Roman daily life from Britain to Egypt had a common, recognizable stamp. Such engineering feats did more than provide convenience. They were a source of civic pride and unity. When the citizens of a provincial city like Emerita in Spain looked at their triple-tiered aqueduct or their stone bridge, they saw themselves as part of the grand Roman story, participants in a civilized lifestyle that the empire promised. Water, roads, and grand buildings were tangible benefits of the Pax Romana. Emperors understood this too. Building projects were a way to appease and impress the populace. Emperor Augustus could boast, "I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble." While somewhat an exaggeration, it reflected his massive building program that truly transformed Rome's cityscape. Later emperors followed suit, each adding to the collective monumentality. Whether it was Trajan with his forum and market complex, a marvel of urban architecture, or Hadrian with the Pantheon. Now, having explored the physical constructs of Roman power and comfort, we turn to the more intangible side of Roman civilization, their beliefs, rituals, and the invisible world of gods and spirits that permeated every aspect of these public and private spaces. For even as the aqueducts carried water and the roads carried armies, the Romans believed that divine forces watched over their city and fields, demanding respect and worship. Let us slow our pace and observe a Roman at prayer, or witness a priest taking the auspices, or join a family around their hearth shrine, to better understand the spiritual rhythms that underlay Roman life, gods, rituals, and superstitions. As evening settles over a Roman town, oil lamps glow in homes and temples. The air fills with the scent of incense from family shrines, mingling with the smell of dinner cooking. In one modest house, a family gathers around a small niche in the wall, their lararium, the household shrine. Inside are tiny figurines of the Lares and Penates, spirits who protect the home and storeroom, perhaps joined by a small statue of Vesta or Apollo, depending on which gods the family favors. The paterfamilias, head of the household, pulls part of his toga over his head, lights incense, and pours a few drops of wine onto the little altar. He thanks the gods for their meal and asks for their continued blessing. It's a simple, familiar act, one happening in homes all across the Roman world, night after night. For ordinary Romans, religion isn't a Sunday ritual. It's part of everyday life, as routine as cooking or cleaning. Step outside, and you'll see that faith is woven into every corner of the city. Every neighborhood has its own small sacred space, a street corner altar draped in flowers, a fountain dedicated to local spirits, even a tree or oddly shaped stone believed to hold divine power. The Roman calendar is packed with festivals. There's always a holy day just around the corner. The very word religio means a kind of binding, a sacred contract between humans and gods. The Romans' guiding idea, Dut des I give so that you may give, summed up how they saw the world. A system of careful give and take with the divine. They believed their success came not just from armies or politics, but from piety doing right by the gods. Rome ruled the world, they thought, because the gods favored her. Now picture a grand ceremony at the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. It's Jupiter's festival day. Magistrates in bright robes lead a white ox up the steps, the animal adorned with ribbons. A flutist plays a steady tune, meant to drown out any unlucky noises. The priests, perhaps the Flamen Dialis, Jupiter's own priest, examine the ox carefully. Any flaw, even the slightest hesitation, could be a bad sign. The prayers begin. Wine is poured over the ox's head. The animal is struck, its throat cut, and its blood caught in a basin. As incense curls through the air, priests inspect the entrails, especially the liver, a tradition borrowed from the Etruscans. A smooth, perfect liver means Jupiter is pleased. A blemish means trouble. If all looks well, the crowd cheers. The god is satisfied. The best cuts are burned on the altar, their smoke rising heavenward, while the rest becomes part of a communal feast. These rituals weren't just religious, they were social glue. affirming the bond between gods and citizens. But religion didn't stop at temples. It shaped how Romans governed, fought wars, and made decisions. Augurs, priests trained to read omens, observed birds, thunder, or the behavior of sacred chickens before major events. Before any election or battle, they took the auspices. If the birds ate greedily, it was a good omen. If they refused, it was bad. One famous story tells of Publius Claudius Pulcher in 249 BCE, about to face Carthage in battle. The sacred chickens wouldn't eat. Frustrated, Claudius tossed them into the sea, saying, "If they won't eat, let them drink." He lost the battle and his reputation. To Romans, ignoring divine signs was asking for disaster. Even skeptical thinkers like Cicero, himself an augur, played along. Whether or not they truly believed, everyone agreed you didn't risk angering the gods. Roman religion was layered and complex. At the top was the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, a title later adopted by the popes. The Vestal Virgins, 6 girls chosen to serve the goddess Vesta, tended the eternal flame of Rome and were honored but sworn to chastity, under threat of being buried alive if they broke their vow. Other priests served specific gods and followed strict taboos. Jupiter's priest, for instance, couldn't ride a horse or even touch metal. Alongside them were foreign cults: Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Anatolia, which offered more emotional and personal forms of worship. A typical Roman might mix and match: a prayer to Mercury before a trade deal, a toast to Hercules with friends, an offering to Isis at a festival. Religion wasn't exclusive. The more gods on your side, the better. And for all their public rituals, Romans were deeply superstitious. The historian Polybius once said, "Rome's power came from its fear of the gods," and he wasn't wrong. In the marketplace, a mother warns her child, "Don't step with your left foot." The left was unlucky. The Latin sinister literally means left. The right, dexter, was good luck. People cured hiccups by kissing a mule's nose, avoided touching their own bodies when talking about illness, in case it spread, and feared the hoot of an owl as a sign of death. To ward off evil, Romans wore amulets, babies wore bullae, and adults hung little bronze phalluses, yes, you read that right, as charms against the evil eye. Cyclamen flowers were thought to repel bad magic, and when sickness struck, a whispered charm or home ritual was often the first line of defense. In the countryside, old folk rules thrived. Never marry in May, the month of the dead. Plant trees under a waxing moon, and drive away ghosts during Lemuria, the annual festival of the restless dead. On those nights in May, the father of the house walked barefoot through the dark, tossing black beans over his shoulder while chanting, "With these beans, I redeem me and mine." The rest of the family banged bronze pots, shouting until the spirits were gone. Romans also loved divination and astrology. Many consulted fortune tellers or personal astrologers, despite laws against it. Emperors like Augustus and Tiberius had court astrologers. Ordinary people wrote curse tablets, thin sheets of lead, calling upon dark gods to punish thieves, rivals, or unfaithful lovers. Magic and religion blurred together. Both were tools to manage life's uncertainties. Cicero once joked that he was amazed 2 augurs could pass each other on the street without laughing a sly nod to the tension between belief and skepticism. Still, even philosophers who doubted the rituals rarely defied them. To ignore the gods was dangerous business. And so, as night deepens, the Roman family ends their day as they began it with a small offering of wine to their genius, the household spirit, and a prayer to Janus, guardian of doorways and beginnings. They shut the doors, hang charms against wandering spirits, and settle into sleep under the quiet watch of countless gods. For Romans, religion wasn't something apart from life, it was life. From the soldier's oath to the farmer's plough, from contracts to meals, everything began and ended with the divine. But soon, a new faith from a distant province, one that preached one God instead of many, would begin to spread. At first, dismissed and persecuted, it would eventually transform the empire completely. The age of Jupiter and Vesta was drawing to a close. The age of Christianity was about to begin. Daily life in Rome, citizens and slaves, urban and rural. Before we delve into the epical religious transformation, it will help to paint a full picture of daily life in the Roman world, to see how people lived, worked, and socialized on an everyday basis. The rhythms of life differed if you were a wealthy senator in Rome, or a peasant farmer in Gaul, a merchant in bustling Alexandria, or a legionary's wife in a frontier fort. Yet there were common threads that tied together these experiences under the umbrella of Rome's peace and rule. In this section, we stroll through the streets of the imperial capital, then venture to the quiet countryside and peek into the lives of both the free citizens who enjoyed Roman rights and the enslaved people who formed the empire's labor backbone. It's a journey into the ordinary, the smell of bread from a bakery, the clamor of a tavern at night, the sweat of harvest, the hush of a patrician's atrium at siesta hour, all the textures of the boring daily existence that modern historians find so fascinating. Urban life, the city of Rome. Let's begin in Rome, Caput Mundi, the head of the world. By the 2nd century CE, Rome is a cosmopolitan metropolis of perhaps 1 million residents, making it the largest city on earth at that time. Imagine standing on the Forum Romanum at midday. The Forum is the city's central public space, a rectangle of open ground paved in travertine, surrounded by grand temples and basilicas, public halls. It bustles with activity. Hawkers call out the prices of figs and olives from their barrows. Orators with fervent gestures try to win a crowd's ear on some legal case or philosophical idea. Foreign ambassadors in colourful attire gawk at the monuments, scribbling notes to report back home. Schoolboys follow their teacher in a line, perhaps chanting a lesson in Greek. Amid the crowd move the well-to-do, easily spotted by their crisp white togas with a purple stripe if they're senators or equestrians. Their personal slaves, called kleantes, attend them, maybe carrying scrolls or messages. A magistrate passes by, preceded by lictors, bearing the fasces bundled rods, symbolizing his authority. Ordinary citizens wear tunics, or, if of a status to do so on formal errands, the toga. Women are draped in stolas, long dresses, and pallas, shawls, if respectable, or shorter tunics and makeup, if perhaps of the less respectable sort. One can see some women at street corners, possibly soliciting. Prostitution is legal and relatively common, often signaled by a woman wearing a flame yellow wig. The noise in the city is constant. One hears Latin spoken in many accents, Greek too, the common second language of the empire, plus snippets of Syriac, Egyptian, Gaulish, and other tongues among the multicultural populace. The clatter of wheels is actually restricted during daylight, in the heart of the city, by law to reduce congestion. But by night, the wagons will rumble through, hauling goods from the river docks at Ostia. Right now, you smell baking bread, A nearby Pistrinum bakery is at work, its millstone turned by a mule or by slaves, grinding grain to flour. Large commercial bakeries produce most of the bread for Rome, bread which is, thanks to the grain dole, either free or subsidized for a huge portion of the population. Since the time of Augustus, some 200,000 adult male citizens in Rome, and by extension their families, receive a regular grain allotment from the state. By the empire's heyday, it may include actual baked loaves distributed daily. This policy, the annona, ensures that the urban masses, many of whom are underemployed or living in poverty, have their basic food met. It is one of the keys to maintaining order, hence the phrase, bread and circuses, keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't rebel. As you walk the streets, stepping carefully around occasional piles of animal dung or human, to refuse, though public latrines exist, not everyone uses them. You note the buildings that line most streets, tall insulae or apartment blocks. These are typically 3 to 5 stories high, constructed of brick and wood. The lower floors might house shops that open onto the street, the bakery, a wine shop, tavern with an identifying ivy bush hanging over the door, maybe a stall selling cloth or spices. Upstairs, via external staircases or inner courtyards, are cramped flats where the majority of urban dwellers live. The construction quality can be shoddy. Collapses and fires are a frequent hazard. The Great Fire of 64 AD, in Nero's time, infamously destroyed much of the city. In fact, one can smell a faint acrid tang in the air that is characteristic of Rome. It's the smoke from countless hearth fires and lamps, and the not infrequent conflagrations. Many insulae are built cheaply by landlords trying to maximize rental income. They might lack kitchens or plumbing above the ground floor. Thus, ordinary people cook over braziers or buy hot food from street vendors, and they visit public fountains to draw water. Water, which, fortunately, is plentiful, thanks to aqueducts. Waste, well, some buildings have latrines that empty into cesspits or the cloaca sewer, but others simply rely on chamber pots dumped out of windows. It's wise to keep an ear open for a shout of, "Beware below," that might precede someone emptying slops from above. Roman satirists joked about the danger of falling pots of sewage or broken roof tiles hitting pedestrians. In fact, the poet Juvenal quipped that walking the streets of Rome at night, one risks being drenched by a chamber pot thunderbolt, so one should wear a broad-brimmed hat. Despite these hazards, city life has its delights. You might pop into a thermopolium, a small shop with big clay jars set in a counter, which serves hot food like a ladle of lentil stew or spiced wine for a few bronze coins. Such eateries cater to those who don't have a kitchen at home, which is most residents. At noon, they're crowded with laborers, grabbing a quick bite. Wandering further, you find yourself in an open market, perhaps the Forum of Trajan, or a neighborhood market street. Here are fishmongers with the catch from the Tiber, or the sea tilapia, eels, mullets, vegetable sellers with cabbages and turnips, fruit sellers with figs, dates, and apples depending on season, the smell of fresh herbs, dill, cilantro, rue, mixes with less pleasant odors of raw meat from the butcher's stall. Meat is relatively expensive and not eaten daily by the poor. They rely on cereals, but for the wealthy, cuts of pork, beef and lamb hang in the stalls. The merchants shout their prices, haggling as expected. Shrewd housewives pinch the produce to check quality. Slaves might be sent by rich households to do the marketing, carrying big baskets. Let's talk about the social classes glimpsed here. At the top of the urban social pyramid are the senators, a tiny elite of a few hundred families with immense wealth, owning luxurious homes on the Palatine and elsewhere, dining on stuffed dormice and fine Falernian wine from silver plate. They hold the highest offices. But senators themselves often retreat to their country villas in summer. The city is muggy and disease-prone. The next class, the equestrians, knights, are prosperous business folk, landlords, and officials. They might live in comfortable townhouses, domus, on the Esquiline or Caelian hills, with a dozen slaves to maintain the household. These rich homes are an alternate reality from the street. Behind relatively plain exteriors, they open into atria with marble floors, impluvium pools catching rainwater, and walls adorned with frescoes. A patron like that might host a daily morning salutatio, where his clients, poorer dependents, or freedmen, come to pay respects, and in return, often receive a small handout or help, part of the patron-client system that underpins society. So in the early mornings, you'd see groups of modestly dressed clients milling outside the doorways of the great houses, waiting for admission. The majority of people, however, are the plebs, common free citizens, and a great many freedmen, ex-slaves, who've been manumitted. They work as craftsmen, shoemakers, blacksmiths, fullers, cleaning woolen cloth with urine in vats, a pungent business, petty traders, clerks in offices, or day labourers. Many have uncertain employment, picking up what work they can at the docks or construction sites. For entertainment, they might spend evenings at the taverns, which are smoky little rooms, often doubling as gambling dens. Over cups of cheap wine diluted with vinegar, they'll play dice games or betting games like Capita et Navia heads or ships, similar to coin flipping, or listen to a wandering lute player sing a ribald song. The tavern is also where neighbourhood gossip spreads, who ran off with whose wife, whose son got in trouble, which charioteer is favoured to win the next big race. Ah yes, the races and games, crucial to urban life. Rome's populace is sports mad, especially for chariot racing at the Circus Maximus. On race days frequent, usually tied to festivals, and often funded by magistrates or the emperor to curry favour, the city empties toward the circus. Up to 250,000 people pack that colossal arena to watch the four factions, reds, blues, greens, whites, compete. People wear their faction colours and shout themselves hoarse. Money changes hands in heavy betting. The outcome of a race might lead to scuffles or even riots if fans feel cheated. In the evenings after a race day, the winning charioteer's name, say, Scorpius of the Greens, is on everyone's lips. Kids race makeshift toy carts in the alleys, pretending to be their heroes. Similarly, on days of gladiatorial games at the Colosseum, there's a morbid excitement as crowds line up at dawn to get seats. If free tickets have been distributed by a sponsoring editor or the emperor, by late afternoon, after a series of bloody duels, the talk in the baths and taverns is all about which gladiator fought bravely, which died poorly, whether the referee's calls were fair, and the thrilling moment a tiger leapt the barrier. Speaking of baths, this is another pillar of daily life for urban Romans. Late afternoon, many head to one of the numerous public bath complexes, thermae. We visited Caracalla's earlier. Besides those imperial megabaths, each neighbourhood has smaller baths too. For a couple of quadrans, copper coins, you get exercise, bathing, and socialising. It's an essential routine that cuts across class lines, though the rich often have private baths at home too. People of all backgrounds meet in the steamy caldarium or scrub each other's backs in the tepidarium. Business deals can be discussed in the baths. Gossip certainly is exchanged freely. Bathhouses often have adjacent libraries, gardens, or eateries, so they function like community centers. As night falls, the city doesn't sleep immediately. The poor in insulae might suffer sleeplessness due to heat in summer, bedbugs, and noise from neighbors. The walls are thin. The main streets are intermittently lit by oil lamps on posts or hanging in shop fronts, but many areas are dark. Watchmen patrol with lanterns, though crime is a concern. Muggers may lurk in alley shadows. Prudent folks travel with a few companions, or hire a slave with a torch to guide them if they must go out. For entertainment, some may attend a theatre play or a gladiator banquet. Gladiators often dined in public as a form of spectacle, but more likely, people wrap up their day early. The city gates close at a certain hour, an old habit from times when security was needed. By the Empire, the gates were less critical due to peace, but the curfew for wagons and such remains until after dark. Now, leaving Rome, let's briefly look at another side of daily life, the countryside. Most inhabitants of the empire are actually rural, peasant farmers, estate slaves, small-town artisans. A day on a Roman farm begins even earlier than in the city. Before first light, a farmer and his family, and slaves or hired hands if he has them, are up. They live in a simple stone or mud brick cottage, maybe 2 rooms, one for living, sleeping, one for storing tools, or a small stable area. Chickens scratch in the yard, perhaps a pig or 2 in a pen. If it's late spring, they're busy weeding crops. If autumn, the grape harvest or olive harvest may be on, calling for all hands. The farmer's wife grinds grain to make the coarse bread for breakfast. She's also in charge of tending a vegetable patch and maybe milking a goat. Children help from a young age, scaring birds from the fields or fetching water from the well. The pace of rural life is dictated by seasons and sun. Unlike in the city, artificial light is sparse, just a tallow lamp or 2 at night. So everyone rises with the dawn and retires after dusk, exhausted. Meals are plain: porridge of emmer wheat, bread, beans, occasionally salted fish, if trade reaches them. Out in the fields, the farmer might chat over a boundary with his neighbor, doing the same work, exchanging tips about weather signs. The religious calendar guides him too. Certain days are marked for certain tasks. Perhaps on one day he won't plough because it's considered inauspicious, dies, nefastus, or he will say a prayer and sprinkle grain for Ceres before starting the planting. In spring, he observes the Perilia festival, shepherds leaping through bonfires with their flocks to purify them. Many farmlands are not owned by small farmers at all, by the imperial period, but by wealthy absentee landlords, often senators, who have large estates, latifundia, run by slave labor or tenant sharecroppers. On such an estate, an overseer, usually a literate slave or freedman, the villicus manages dozens of field slaves. Their life is harsh. They labor from dawn till dusk, under threat of the lash, sleep in barracks, and have minimal rations: a bit of grain, olive oil, maybe wine heavily watered. Cato the Elder, in his farming manual, even advised sparing ailing slaves the doctor fee and just replacing them if they can't work, a cold view treating them almost like farm animals. On some estates, there are indeed ergastula, essentially prison-like workhouses, where slaves are chained at night to prevent escape. The death rates can be high, especially in the most grueling sectors, like mines, where being sent to a Spanish silver mine was akin to a death sentence. Workers in shafts lived only a few years in terrible conditions, often convicts or war captives made to toil until they died. Yet not all slaves suffered equally. In urban settings, many slaves had skilled or domestic roles: tutors, secretaries, cooks, hairdressers, and so forth. A household slave in a senator's mansion might actually live more comfortably than a free plebeian in a slum. They ate better leftovers, wore decent tunics, and sometimes had the ear of their master or mistress, which gave them influence. The Roman institution of slavery was complex. Slaves were property with no legal personhood, yet they were human beings embedded in the household and could be treated with affection or even become part of the family in a sense. A faithful slave might be freed by their master at some point. Manumission was common, creating a large class of freedmen in Rome, who then became clients of their former owners. Freedmen often took their patron's family name and could prosper in trades and crafts. Some became quite wealthy, though barred from high office. Many tombstones surviving in Rome are of freedmen, expressing pride in their achievements after slavery, often mentioning the patron's name as a mark of status. Within slave hierarchy, there was even stratification. Some slaves supervised others, like the villicus on a farm, or the head cook over kitchen slaves. Some were well educated, Greeks, employed as teachers or doctors. These might eventually gain freedom, or at least be valued highly. At the bottom were those in the mines, galleys, or those unfortunates condemned as gladiators or arena fodder. A few slaves who suffered extreme cruelty left us famous anecdotes, like a wealthy man's entire household of 400 slaves was executed because one of them killed him. Roman law allowed that collective punishment. But also, some slaves, especially household ones, were virtually part of the family, nursing the children, managing estates. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius was said to treat his household slaves with kindness, and wrote in his meditations that one should be gentle, even with slaves. Family life in general among free Romans was patriarchal. The paterfamilias, oldest male, had the legal patria potestas, power of life and death over his children, though by the empire, actually killing an adult child would be socially unacceptable and rare. Still, he legally owned all family property. Sons remained under his power until he died, even if they were grown and married. Women, especially of higher status, had surprisingly a fair amount of independence by the empire. They could own property, if under a legal guardian in name, run businesses, and were often literate. The ideal matron managed the household finances and slaves efficiently. Marriages among the elite were often arranged and more about alliance than love, though personal affection could develop. Among the poor, marriage might just be common law, as slaves couldn't legally marry, but formed relationships called contubernium, and many freed or poor citizens just cohabited. Children were treasured, but also subject to high infant mortality. At birth, a baby would be laid at the father's feet, if he picked it up. It signified acceptance exposure of unwanted infants. While not pervasive, did happen, especially if the family was too poor, or if the baby was deformed, or, in some cases, simply not the desired sex. Girls were more often exposed than boys. Those left out might be rescued by others and raised as slaves. Education for those who could afford it meant boys, and some girls, going to a ludus, elementary school, to learn reading, writing, arithmetic. The teacher was often a Greek freedman. Corporal punishment was normal. The sound of boys being beaten is music to the teacher's ears, one satirist wrote wryly. Bright and rich boys then progressed to learn rhetoric in their teens, preparing for public life. Lower-class kids, by contrast, learned the family trade early or just helped at home. Many children from poor families were effectively working by 10 or 12, hawking wares, gathering firewood, minding siblings. Daily food for most was grain-based, pulmentum, porridge, or bread with maybe some cheese or olives, and vegetable soup. Meat was a rare treat, except at festivals. For example, the leftover sacrifices from a temple might be distributed. The rich, however, feasted on a great variety. Dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, roasted game, fresh fish from afar. They shipped oysters lived to Rome in barrels of seawater, and exotic spices from India on everything. A grand dinner at a senator's house might have multiple courses, appetizers of eggs and olives. Hence the saying, ab ovo usque ad mala, from the egg to the apples, meaning the whole meal. Then mains like boar or lamb, then sweets and fruit. Diners reclined on couches in a triclinium, 3-couch dining room, while slaves served wine and dishes. Conversation and recitations of poetry might accompany the meal, or a hired Greek musician playing softly. The clothing we see reflects class and activity. Common men in tunics of undyed wool, perhaps with a belt, women in a long tunic, and if respectable, a stola over it once married. The elite male citizen's formal wear was the toga, but it was cumbersome, 18 feet of wool wrapped around, and usually only worn on formal occasions or by officials. Day to day, even nobles often wore simpler tunics at home or around town. Footwear ranged from simple sandals to sturdy hobnailed boots for soldiers or workmen. The poor might go barefoot in summer for travel or bad weather. Cloaks, pennula or sargum came out, often hooded. An interesting slice of life. Let's say it's a festival day of Saturnalia, late December. This was like a carnival, social norms inverted somewhat. Masters served meals to slaves symbolically, or they dined together. Slaves were allowed to joke freely with masters. People wore a freedman's cap, pileus, to signal temporary equality. Gift-giving among friends and family took place, and lots of feasting. The city would be in a holiday mood, with businesses closed and everyone wearing bright clothes instead of their usual togas. Gambling, normally frowned on, was allowed during Saturnalia, so you'd see even respectable folks playing dice openly. It was, as one poet said, the best of days. The empire's unity meant that daily life in, say, a provincial city like Ephesus or Carthage, while having local flavor, different gods, languages in use, local customs, still had many of these Roman features. Forums, baths, theatres, amphitheatres, and people moving about them in tunics and togas, speaking Latin in officialdom, though Greek in the East, Punic, etc. in private perhaps. A traveller from Gaul visiting Syria would find familiar institutions like the bathhouses and similar street foods, though spiced differently. Such was the homogenizing effect of Roman rule and the mobility it allowed. Soldiers and merchants carried culture with them. By understanding these intimate details of daily routines, the tavern brawls, the market haggling, the lullabies a mother sings to her baby, the weariness of a farmer as he sees a storm that might ruin his crop, we get closer to the humanity of Roman history. It's easy to focus on emperors and battles, but truly, Rome's legacy lived as much in how it shaped ordinary existence, providing roads and aqueducts that eased life, laws that governed transactions, a calendar of festivities that gave joy and structure, and a cosmopolitan environment where a person could walk from one end of a great city to the other, hearing a dozen languages and tasting foods from 3 continents. Now, having walked in the sandals of Rome's people, patrician and plebeian, citizen and slave, we have a richer context to approach the monumental change that will sweep through their world. The transition to Christianity. This new faith will challenge the traditional religious tapestry that we saw was deeply interwoven with daily life, and eventually become the dominant belief system, backed by emperors and shaping laws. How will this affect the social fabric? We shall explore that sea change, keeping in mind those ordinary Romans we've come to know, and how their daily life and worldview might be turned upside down when old temples close and new churches rise. From pagan Rome to Christian empire, it is the early 4th century AD, and something unprecedented is happening in the Roman world. After centuries of ambivalence or outright persecution, the Roman state is on the verge of embracing a once marginal sect, Christianity, and with that, altering the religious landscape that we have just discussed in such detail. To appreciate how dramatic this transition is, recall how the traditional Roman religion permeated everything: the festivals, the auspices, the household shrines, the emperor's role as Pontifex Maximus, the very legitimacy of state actions resting on divine favor. Now imagine that gradually, one exclusive faith supplants this entire system. This process was not instantaneous. It unfolded over the 4th and 5th centuries, and it was often contentious. Let's unravel the story of how Rome went from a pantheon of Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and countless others, to the worship of one God and his Son and Holy Spirit, and what this meant for the empire's politics and people. In the year 312 AD, the empire is divided among rival claimants. One of them, Constantine, marches toward a decisive battle against his foe, Maxentius, who holds Rome. On the eve of battle, a legend says, Constantine had a vision. He looked up at the sun and saw a brilliant cross of light above it, and the Greek words, en teutonica, in this sign, conquer, or, in another account by the Christian bishop, Eusebius, Constantine's biographer, the night before the battle, Christ appeared to Constantine in a dream and told him to mark his soldiers' shields with the Chi-Rho, the monogram of Christ. Constantine, who up to then likely worshipped the unconquered sun, Sol Invictus, as many soldiers did, took this vision to heart. He ordered his army to adorn their shields with the new holy sign, the overlapping Greek letters Chi and Rho, the first letters of Christos. The next day, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome, Constantine won a crushing victory. Maxentius was killed, and Constantine entered Rome as the sole ruler of the western half of the empire. Within a year, in 313 AD, Constantine met with his eastern co-emperor Licinius in Milan, and together they issued the famous Edict of Milan. This decree granted legal toleration to Christians, ending the persecutions and restoring confiscated church property. It was not yet an elevation of Christianity to state religion that would come later, but it made the empire officially neutral and benevolent towards the once despised faith. For the Christian community, which by this time numbered perhaps 5 to 10% of the empire's population, this was a miraculous turn of fortune. Only a decade earlier, 303 to 311 AD, Under Emperor Diocletian, the great persecution had tried to stamp out the faith, churches destroyed, scriptures burned, many martyrs tortured and executed for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor's genius or the Roman gods. Christians had often been convenient scapegoats in prior times too. For example, Emperor Nero, as mentioned earlier, blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and subjected them to horrific deaths. Various emperors, notably Decius in 250 AD and later Diocletian, had enforced empire-wide edicts requiring sacrifice to the gods as a loyalty test, leading to waves of persecution when Christians, who were monotheistic and forbidden by their faith to worship other gods, refused. Many were imprisoned, thrown to beasts, or otherwise killed for their obstinacy. Now, under Constantine's protection, the long night of fear was over. The Edict of Milan not only allowed Christians to worship freely, but also generally established religious liberty in the empire. It applied to all, saying essentially that every person could follow whatever religion they pleased. This was a pragmatic move. Constantine and Licinius likely believed that reimposing Pax Deorum, peace with the gods, meant letting all deities have their due. But there's little doubt that Constantine had a particular favor for the Christian God from this point. He donated imperial funds to build basilicas, large churches, in important cities. In Rome, he sponsored the construction of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome, and Old Street, Peter's Basilica on Vatican Hill, among others. He also granted privileges to the Christian clergy, such as exemptions from certain civic duties and taxes, per a law in 313. In effect, he began integrating the Christian church into the imperial establishment. Over the rest of his reign, he would rule until 337 AD, eventually as sole emperor of a reunified empire. Constantine continued these policies. He also involved himself in church affairs. Notably, he convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, summoning bishops from all over to settle a theological dispute. The Arian controversy over the nature of Christ. Was he of the same substance as God the Father, or a created being? This had split Christians. Constantine, though not yet baptized, played an overseeing role, and the council produced the Nicene Creed to define Christian orthodoxy. This was a turning point. Never before had an emperor taken such direct interest in doctrinal matters of a specific religion. Constantine's personal faith can be debated. Some say he was a true believer who credited Christ for his victories. Others that he was half syncretic, still honoring the sun god on coins for years after. He deferred baptism until his deathbed, a common practice then, believing baptism cleansed all prior sins. People sometimes waited to have a pure baptism right before dying. But there's no question he set Christianity on a path to prominence. The political ramifications of Christianity's rise were immense. In 380 AD, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity, specifically the Nicene Creed version of Christianity, was declared the Park, official state religion, by the Edict of Thessalonica. This meant that the Roman Empire now explicitly favored Christianity and outlawed many traditional practices. Already Theodosius had, in 391 to 392, issued edicts essentially banning pagan rituals, forbidding public sacrifices and closing temples. The Vestal Virgins were disbanded, the eternal flame in the Temple of Vesta extinguished after burning for over 1,000 years. The altar of victory, a symbol of Rome's old gods, was removed from the Senate House amid heated debate. Traditional senators like Symmachus pleaded for its restoration, but Christian leaders like Ambrose of Milan insisted on its removal. Step by step, the open practice of the old religion was curtailed. For many common people, this was confusing and even traumatic. Imagine a farmer in rural Italy. For generations, his family has observed the festivals of Saturn, Ceres, etc. Now the imperial decrees say those ceremonies are forbidden. His local temple's doors are shuttered. Statues of the gods may be confiscated or destroyed by zealous Christian monks. Over time, he's told to bring his devotions to the Christian church in town, to honor a different holy day, Sunday, rather than Saturn's day, Saturday, and to baptize his children into this new faith. Some did so readily. Often the poor and oppressed had already found hope in Christianity's message of salvation and equality of souls. Indeed, Christianity had spread in cities among all classes, including slaves, offering community and charity. Christian churches by the late empire were running welfare for the poor and sick, which endeared them to many. But others clung to the old ways quietly. Hence the term paganus, originally just meant country dweller, came to be synonymous with those still following the old polytheism, since it was in out-of-the-way villages that the ancestral gods held out longest, while cities Christianized faster. The shift also produced tensions. As Christianity became dominant, its leaders gained influence over imperial policy. For example, Bishop Ambrose of Milan famously confronted Emperor Theodosius in 390 AD after Theodosius ordered a massacre in Thessalonica. Ambrose excommunicated the emperor until he did penance, which Theodosius did, humbling himself in church. This was a new power dynamic, a bishop compelling an emperor's public repentance on moral grounds. It foreshadowed the medieval pattern of church and state struggles. But even at this early stage, one sees that emperors could no longer claim divine status, like Augustus had. Instead, they were seen as sons of the church, ideally subject to the same God's law as everyone. Meanwhile, laws increasingly reflected Christian values. Gladiatorial games, long a staple of Roman entertainment, were increasingly frowned upon by Christian moralists for their bloodshed. By tradition, the last gladiator combat in Rome was in 404 AD, after which Honorius Emperor in the West banned the games, allegedly spurred by the martyrdom of a Christian monk named Telemachus, who tried to stop a fight and was killed by angry spectators, which shocked the emperor into action. Whether that exact tale is true, it's recorded that gladiatorial schools were closed. Other laws abolished pagan holidays or repurposed them as Christian ones. For example, the festival of Saturnalia and Sol Invictus on Deck 25 eventually became Christmas. The calendar was Christianized. The old feast of Lupercalia in February was suppressed, etc. Instead, new celebrations, like Easter and saints' feast days, filled the year. There were also darker sides. After being persecuted, some Christians, once in power, persecuted pagans or heretics. Theodosius's decrees threatened penalties for those performing sacrifices or even just visiting pagan temples. In some places, mobs led by zealous clergy smashed idols and temples. One famous case in 392 AD was the destruction of Serapeum in Alexandria, a magnificent temple to Serapis, by a Christian crowd. The old intellectual elite, which had included many who were still pagan, or at least Neoplatonist, like the philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, found themselves increasingly under suspicion or marginalized. Hypatia herself was brutally murdered by a Christian mob in 415 AD, an incident symbolizing how far intolerance could go. Nonetheless, the transition in many parts of the empire was relatively gradual, and sometimes just on paper. Evidence suggests many rural folk continued folk practices, like leaving offerings at springs or groves, which the church tried to co-opt rather than eradicate, for example, saying those springs were now dedicated to a certain saint instead of a nymph. For the ordinary Roman who accepted Christianity, life changed in rituals and worldview. They now attended church, ecclesia, on Sundays, hearing readings from scripture and sermons. Perhaps some missed the lively storytelling of myths and theatre, but the church did incorporate some dramatic liturgy of its own. The sacraments, baptism, Eucharist, became key milestones in life. The care of souls became an organized affair under a hierarchical clergy, bishops, priests, deacons. The local bishop often took over roles previously done by civic patrons, distributing food to the poor, negotiating during crises. For example, when barbarians threatened a city, bishops often led delegations to arrange ransoms or truces. In that sense, the church became a kind of parallel government, particularly as the Western Empire's secular institutions began to weaken in the 5th century. People now looked to their bishop as well as the imperial governor for leadership. Politically, one immediate effect of Christianization was a more pronounced East-West cultural split. The empire had already been administratively split for some time, but now religion drew lines too. The East, Greek-speaking, had been the seedbed of Christianity and had large Christian majorities earlier. The West took to it a bit more slowly and had a stronger remaining pagan senatorial class for longer. Also, theological differences emerged. The Arian heresy, which taught Christ was not equal to the Father, was popular especially among many Eastern Gothic tribes and some Eastern Christians, whereas Nicene orthodoxy prevailed in Rome. Emperors like Constantius, Constantine's son, and Valens in the East adhered to Arian Christianity at times, while the West often was more orthodox. Theodosius ended Arian influence at the imperial level by the Edict of Thessalonica, making Nicene Christianity the only legitimate form, but lingering divergences remained. This occasionally caused friction. For example, barbarian foederati in the West were often Arian Christians and had a different creed from the Roman populace they ruled after the Western Empire fell in 476. In daily social mores, Christianity brought some changes. Public morals were a bit stricter, at least in ideal. Sexual licentiousness was frowned on. Divorce laws got tighter, though under Roman law, divorce had been relatively easy by mutual consent. Christians leaned towards making marriage indissoluble, but the actual law in the early Christian empire still allowed some divorce. Practices like exposure of infants were condemned by church leaders, and eventually laws against infanticide came. The gladiatorial killings ended. The status of slaves might have improved slightly, as Christian teaching held that master and slave were equal before God. Some Christian writers, like Gregory of Nyssa, even denounced slavery as incompatible with Christ's teachings, though the institution itself continued. One could say the society was nudged towards a bit more compassion under the influence of Christian ethics, though in practice, a lot remained brutal about late Roman life. Judicial torture, draconian punishments, warfare, none of that vanished. Another big shift: temples, converted to churches. In Rome, Many ancient temples, such as the Pantheon, were eventually consecrated as churches. The Pantheon became Street Mary and the Martyrs in the 7th century, which is why it survived intact. Some others were left to crumble. The artistic depiction of gods in human form was replaced by new Christian art, mosaics of Christ, Mary, saints, etc., adorning basilica walls, where once frescoes of Hercules or Jupiter might have been. By the end of the 4th century, a visitor to a major Roman city would see a cityscape increasingly dominated by cross-topped basilica roofs, in addition to, or replacing, the old classical colonnaded temples. If he attended the imperial court, he'd notice officials and emperors no longer performing sacrifices to Jupiter, but rather perhaps praying in a church before a campaign. When taking an oath, they now swore by God or on the Gospels, rather than by the genius of the emperor or the altar of a deity. This was nothing less than a civilizational pivot. The Roman Empire that entered the 5th century was officially a Christian empire, a concept that would carry forward after the Western Empire's fall into the Byzantine East and the emerging barbarian kingdoms that converted, like King Clovis of the Franks in 496, who embraced Catholic Christianity, or the conversion of the Visigothic kingdom from Arian to Catholic in 589. The Church as an institution would, in those unstable times, preserve a great deal of Roman knowledge and structure, becoming a bridge between the classical past and medieval future. Yet, for all the change, certain continuities persisted. People still spoke Latin in the West, though gradually evolving into early Romance languages. They still called themselves Roman. Even the post-Empire Gothic and Frankish kings used Roman administrative systems and titles. Law codes of Christian emperors still built on the old Roman law. In fact, one of the most lasting legacies of the Christian emperors was the Codex of Theodosius, 438 AD, compiling laws, including those about religion, and later, the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, 529 to 534 AD, which systematized Roman law, a law which now assumed the Church's privileged place and Christian moral assumptions. The era of temple sacrifices, Vestal virgins, and Olympic gods receded into history. The last recorded pagan high-profile holdouts, like some senators in Rome or philosophers like those of the Academy in Athens, either converted or saw their institutions closed. The Platonic Academy was shut by Justinian in 529 as part of rooting out pagan teachings. A Christian Rome, in spirit if not always in practice, had arisen, and that Rome's influence would spread through Europe such that, even after the empire, the idea of a united Christendom under a Roman Church became the dominant narrative. For our story's purposes, the Roman Empire's embrace of Christianity did indeed bring significant political ramifications. Church and state intertwined, emperors enforcing doctrinal uniformity, which sometimes persecuted dissenters, pagans, Jews to some extent, and Christian heretics alike. It also shaped foreign relations. For example, when dealing with Persian Sassanid Empire, which was Zoroastrian, Rome's treatment of Persian religious minorities and vice versa became an element in diplomacy, and Persian suspicion of their own Christians as potential fifth column for Christian Rome led to persecutions in Persia when Rome turned officially Christian. We've now seen how dramatically the cultural and religious face of the empire changed between the early 4th and late 4th centuries, roughly a lifetime's span. People who, as children, saw a world of many gods lived to see temples closed and one god exalted. This had profound effects on art, literature, law, identity, arguably as profound as any military conquest. It was an internal revolution of the soul of Rome. Next, with the empire's religious unity, at least officially, achieved, another monumental chapter awaits: the actual splitting of the Roman Empire into two, and the subsequent fall of the western half. While the eastern half, known to us as the Byzantine Empire, endures for centuries more, we will examine how the empire divides along geographic and cultural lines, and how the legacy of Rome carries on, especially in the east, even as the west transitions into the early medieval period. Our journey has taken us from the old Republic's Senate halls to the Christian basilicas. Now it will take us to the walls of Constantinople and the fateful year 476 AD, when the last Western emperor was deposed, drawing one curtain while the light of Rome's heritage continued glimmering in the east. The empire divides, the fall of the West and the Byzantine continuation. In the chill of a late autumn day, in 476 AD, a man named Romulus Augustulus, a mere boy emperor, was compelled to abdicate his throne in Ravenna to a Germanic chieftain, Odoacer. No Roman Augustus would ever rule from Italy again. This event, often cited as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, was in truth less dramatic to contemporaries than we imagine. Odoacer did not sack Rome. The city had been sacked earlier, in 410 by Visigoths and 455 by Vandals. He simply took over the government and, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as nominal suzerain, styled himself King of Italy. The Roman Senate, in a letter to Zeno, effectively said one emperor was enough, and they didn't need a separate Western one. To many, life went on much as before, with Odoacer even cooperating with the Senate and using Roman administrative apparatus. Yet symbolically, it marked the end of the Western imperial line and the beginning of new kingdoms on former Roman soil. The empire had been splitting administratively for a long time. Diocletian c. 300 AD established the Tetrarchy, with multiple co-emperors east and west. Constantine reunified it, but after his death, it often had co-rulers. By Theodosius' death in 395, he left one son, Arcadius, ruling the east from Constantinople, and another, Honorius, ruling the west from Milan. Ravenna, that is traditionally the final division. Never again would one man rule the whole, until much later, fleetingly with Justinian's conquests, though Justinian still sat in Constantinople, not Rome. Why did the West collapse while the East persisted? There are many reasons. The West had more pressure from migrating Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, etc., larger frontiers with fewer natural barriers, and an economy that may have been less robust than the East's. The East centered on the old Hellenistic civilizations of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, was wealthier and more urbanized. Also, by relocating the capital to Constantinople, founded by Constantine on the site of Byzantium in 330 AD, the effective center of gravity moved east. The Western government, often in Italy or sometimes Gaul, struggled with internal strife and constant usurpations. In the 5th century, it became reliant on barbarian federate troops, and gradually those federates carved out their own realms. For example, the Visigoths were settled in Aquitaine, then took much of Gaul and Hispania. The Vandals seized North Africa and even established a fleet dominating the Western Mediterranean. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, survived these crises. It faced its own threats, Persians on its eastern border, some Gothic incursions, like a massive Gothic war, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople, 378, where Eastern Emperor Valens was killed. But the walls of Constantinople, built initially by Constantine and massively expanded by Theodosius II in the 5th century, made the city nearly impregnable. Waves of Huns, Goths, and others could ravage the Balkans, but not take the capital. The East also deftly used diplomacy and gold to redirect some barbarian groups towards the West. Moreover, by the later 5th century, a capable Eastern general, Aspar, and then the Isaurian Emperor Zeno, played a role in the West's final politics. Zeno, at one point, commissioned Theodoric the Ostrogoth to go to Italy and overthrow Odoacer, establishing an Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy that, at least in theory, operated as a continua of Roman administration, albeit under Gothic kings. So, after 476, we have the western provinces in the hands of various Germanic kings, but interestingly, they often sought legitimacy by claiming to be agents of the Roman Empire or by maintaining Roman laws. For instance, Theodoric the Great in Italy, 493–526, ruled as king of the Goths and Italians, keeping the Senate and civil officials largely Roman and issuing edicts in Latin. These successor kingdoms blended Roman and Germanic elements, and gradually a new medieval Latin Christian culture emerged. But people for a while still thought the empire could be restored. Indeed, in 800 AD, Charlemagne's coronation as Roman emperor in the West by the Pope was an attempt to revive the Western Empire's idea, showing the concept of Rome's empire never disappeared from minds. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, which historians later dubbed the Byzantine Empire, continued on 1,000 years more. The term Byzantine is a later historiographical label from Byzantium, the old name of Constantinople. The people there always called themselves Romans, Romaioi. They saw their state as the uninterrupted continuation of the Roman Empire, just Greek-speaking and Christian, and indeed it was. Emperors from Zeno to Justinian to Heraclius to Constantine XI in 1453, each considered themselves Basileus Romaion, Emperor of the Romans. The Eastern Senate still convened, though gradually lost power, and existed until at least the 14th century in some form. Roman law was kept and updated. Justinian's code in 6th, Basil's code in 9th C, etc. Most importantly, the culture transformed. Over the centuries, the Eastern Empire became more Greek, as Latin faded out by 7th century, and more influenced by Eastern Christianity and local customs, so historians mark it as a distinct Byzantine civilization. Yet, if a time traveler from Augustus's era went to Constantinople in, say, 800 AD, they would still find many recognizable Roman things. An emperor who wears the diadem of Constantine, who issues laws called novels in the tradition of Roman law, chariot races still held in the hippodrome with factions. Yes, the blues and greens continued in Byzantium, and even caused a famous riot, the Nika riot of 532. Senators, albeit mostly honorary nobles, milling about, the empire still organized in provinces, themes, and collecting taxes, and calling itself Roman. The Byzantine inhabitants firmly believed they were Romans. As one 10th century writer said, "We are Romans. The others are barbarians." One can say the Roman Empire didn't fall in 476. Only the western half did. In the east, it survived and thrived for centuries. It had ups and downs. Justinian 527 to 565 gloriously reconquered Italy, Africa, and parts of Spain, temporarily reuniting much of the old empire. But after him came plagues, a brutal war with Persia, and then in the 7th century the sudden rise of Islam, which took from the empire the rich provinces of Egypt, Syria, and North Africa. The empire, by 700 AD, was shrunken essentially to Asia Minor, parts of the Balkans, and coastal Anatolia, with a new capital after 717 AD, effectively being Constantinople and surroundings, yet it held on. It adapted to new threats with military reforms, the theme system, Greek fire at sea, and lots of faith. It had a cultural flourishing under the Macedonian dynasty, 9th–11th centuries, and even experienced a comeback. By 1025, under Basil II, the empire was expanding, having subdued the Bulgarians and recovered some Syrian territory. Byzantium in that era was the strongest state in Christendom, influencing the Slavic world with Orthodox Christianity, for example, conversion of Rus. It preserved many classical texts, which later filtered to the west via Italy, especially after Byzantines fled the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Eastern emperors even maintained the idea of Roman universality, such that Western medieval rulers sought recognition or brides from them. Ultimately, Byzantium gradually declined after the 11th century due to internal strife, more crusader entanglements. The Fourth Crusade infamously sacked Constantinople in 1204, and finally the rise of the Ottoman Turks. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453 to Sultan Mehmed II, that is often considered the true final end of the Roman Empire, nearly 1,500 years after Augustus. There's a poignant legend that the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died fighting on the walls and turned to marble to awaken one day when the city would be reclaimed by Christians, showing how deep the myth of Rome endured even at the end. We must note, the idea of Rome's legacy never died. In the East, the Ottomans even titled themselves Caesar of Rome, in Turkish, Kayseri Rum, after taking Constantinople, claiming to inherit the mantle. In the West, as mentioned, the Holy Roman Empire, a German-based empire, claimed to be the continuation from 800 to 1806. Voltaire quipped, "It was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, but the name shows the aspiration." The Orthodox Russians called Moscow the Third Rome after Constantinople, and the Russian Tsar is from Caesar. So, in a sense, though the political structure fell apart in the West and eventually the East, the spirit of the Roman Empire lived on, through laws, language, the Christian Church, and the very concept of a unified, civilized order. Standing at the edge of the old empire, perhaps in Ravenna, amid the fading mosaics of Justinian and Theodora in San Vitale, or in Constantinople's magnificent domed Hagia Sophia, built by Justinian in 537 and still towering today, one feels that continuity. A subject of Justinian or Theodosius would see themselves not as living in a Byzantine or late antique world, but simply the Roman world, albeit Christian and changed, speaking Greek instead of Latin maybe, but proud of being heirs to Augustus and Constantine. If one asked a scholar in 5th century Athens or Alexandria, when did the Roman Empire fall? They'd likely respond, "It hasn't. It's right here, though things are different now." In conclusion, the story we have told is one of transformation, not abrupt collapse. The Roman Empire underwent a metamorphosis from a pagan Mediterranean spanning republic turned autocracy to a bifurcated realm with a Christian heart, then to a medieval Hellenic bastion in the east, and a patchwork of Roman barbarian kingdoms in the west. The Senate we saw in Part 1 lost its power but continued ceremonially in the east. The legions of Part 2 eventually became the themata troops of Byzantium or the warbands of Germanic kings. The aqueducts and roads of Part 3 fell into disrepair in some places in the west, but many still carried water or provided routes for medieval travelers. The gods and superstitions of Part 4 were replaced or syncretized into Christian saints' cults and folk traditions. The daily lives of Part 5 changed slowly. The urban population shrank in many western cities as trade declined, but in the east cities, like Constantinople, stayed populous. Latin gave way to Greek in the east and to evolving local tongues in the west. The transition to Christianity in Part 6 reoriented morality and authority. Now bishops, monasteries, and the Pope in Rome held influence akin to senators and provincial governors of old. And the final division of Part 7 formalized a reality that the empire's halves had diverged, yet each half still called itself Roman. In a calm, reflective tone, as fits our boring history style, we observe that through all these shifts, the Roman Empire did not so much die as transform. Standing in Constantinople in, say, the 10th century, the citizens still cheer chariot races, attend lavish imperial court ceremonies decked in silk and gold, echoes of old Roman pomp, and pray in Christian churches adorned with classical columns taken from ancient temples. They call themselves Romaioi, Romans, and look back to Constantine and Augustus as forefathers. They preserve Roman law and revere the idea of an empire blessed by God. Even in Western Europe, kings issue law codes partly based on Roman law, and Latin remains the language of the church, scholarship, and official documents, the ghost of the Roman Empire, providing a lingua franca and intellectual heritage in the fragmented Dark Ages. So, though the Western Emperor's line ended in 476, one could argue the Roman Empire survived at least until 1,453 inches the east, and its influence far beyond that, into our modern laws, languages, the Romance languages from Latin, Greek influence via Byzantium on Slavic tongues, etc., and the concept of a unified Europe. In that sense, when we ask, when did Rome fall? A thoughtful answer might be, Rome never fully fell. It simply became something new. And as we close our quiet, extensive chronicle, we find comfort in the continuity, the slow turning of a gigantic wheel of history, rather than a sudden plunge into darkness. Today, wandering among the ruins of the Forum in Rome, or the churches of Ravenna, or the city walls of Istanbul, we feel the presence of all these layers of Rome, the Senate speeches, the legion drills, the aqueduct water flowing, the prayers to Jupiter, then to Christ, the everyday bustle of a Roman street, all have left an imprint on our world. Our journey from the halls of the Senate to the altars of Hagia Sophia reminds us that civilizations evolve, but do not vanish overnight. In the steady, measured pace of history, Rome's story ended not with a bang, but with a transformation, imperceptible to those living through it, yet clear to us looking back. And thus, the legacy of Rome, legal, linguistic, architectural, religious, persisted, the Byzantine Empire standing as the living New Rome until the mid-15th century. And beyond that, in every country shaped by Roman heritage, which is virtually all of Western and Central Europe, parts of Africa and Asia, and by extension, the Americas, through European colonization, carrying Roman law and ideals. To end in an atmospheric reflection, envision a dawn in Constantinople around the year 600. The muezzin has not yet come, Islam still in the future. Instead, church bells ring softly from 100 churches. The emperor, perhaps Maurice or Heraclius, attends a morning service in Hagia Sophia, shafts of light catching the incense smoke, as the congregation chants in Greek the same Kyrie eleison that Latin Romans also sang. Outside, in the Forum of Constantine, a column with his statue still stands. Vendors open their stalls. A unit of armored cavalry trots by, part of the empire's frontier army. A scholar in the university is painstakingly copying out on parchment the works of Livy or Plato in a scriptorium, ensuring their survival. The city bustles, arguably the largest and richest in the world now, while the old Rome in Italy is a smaller echo, still dignified with its bishop, the Pope, and memories. Though so much has changed since the days of Caesar, the people of this world still call themselves Roman and carry forward the essence of an empire that refuses to die. Thus concludes our long odyssey through Roman history, a calm narrative of rise, adaptation, endurance, and transformation. In the steady flow of centuries, we saw an ancient republic become a global empire, then gradually morph into a Christian realm split in two, and finally witness the flicker of its eastern flame gutter out, not before igniting countless new lights in Europe and beyond. The Roman story doesn't really end. It just becomes our story. As Gibbon wrote, the end of the Roman Empire was imperceptible to those who lived it, and as we've tried to show, it was indeed a slow fading of one form into another. Our documentary-style journey, steady and detailed, leaves us with perhaps a surprising sense of continuity. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but Roman civilization in many forms continued, in the laws we obey, the words we speak, the faith many follow, and the very idea of a unified world under rule of law. The slow transformation we have chronicled is one of the most fascinating tapestries of history, and it reminds us that even what seems eternal, like Rome at its height, eventually changes. Yet often what comes after carries its memory in every stone and every word.